Every August, while most American kitchens are still buying watermelon at the checkout line, Amish households in places like Lancaster County and Holmes County are already working through a routine that has barely changed in generations. Walk into an Amish pantry in late summer and you will find shelves lined floor to ceiling with jars, sacks, and buckets. Food set aside months before the weather turns. The first time I stood inside a stone-walled pantry outside Millersburg, I lost count of the jars, somewhere past 400. The woman of the house wasn't impressed by the number. "We finished this by March," she said, as if that were simply how a kitchen was supposed to work. What follows are 12 staples that Amish families commonly lay in before the end of August, why the timing matters for each one, and what the evidence actually shows about how long these foods keep. The 12th item comes from a genuinely old preservation method, one that predates modern refrigeration by more than a century and is still used on working farms today. Amish households often buy sugar by the 50 lb sack rather than the 5 lb bag, starting in late July and continuing through August. The reason has less to do with sweetening coffee and more to do with what's coming. Peaches, then pears, then late apples, then grapes, each one arriving in turn and each one needing sugar to become jam, jelly, or canned fruit. Buying ahead of that run means not competing with every other canning household in the county once the fruit actually hits. And there's little downside to buying early. Dry, properly sealed sugar is one of the most stable foods there is. Refined sugar's low moisture content means bacteria and mold can't get a foothold in it, which is why sealed sugar can sit for years, even decades, without spoiling. Amish families typically transfer the sacks into food-grade buckets with gasketed lids to keep out moisture and pests, then leave them in a cool, dry corner of the basement. This is a detail that trips up a lot of first-time canners. Ordinary iodized table salt contains anti-caking agents and iodine that can cloud brine and darken pickles, so it isn't what you want for preserving. Pure canning or pickling salt, plain sodium chloride with nothing added, is what's actually needed, and Amish families tend to buy it by the case well before pickling season peaks, since bulk and hardware stores in canning country routinely sell out of it by early fall. It goes into cucumber pickles, sauerkraut, meat curing, and the sausage making that follows the first hard frost. Like sugar, dry salt doesn't spoil. Stored in a sealed container away from humidity, a case, bought in July, is just as good the following spring. Vinegar is the acid base for pickling, and pickling is how a garden summer glut becomes a winter's worth of side dishes. Amish families often buy it by the gallon in midsummer, both for canning and for the household. Uses vinegar has always had. Cutting grease, rinsing hair, softening laundry, cleaning cast iron. Sealed, factory-bottled vinegar is shelf-stable more or less indefinitely. Its acidity is self-preserving, and buying a supply ahead of the cucumber rush avoids competing for it once every other canner in the area is doing the same thing. Pinto, navy, black, and Great Northern beans bought in 25 lb sacks are a staple of Amish pantries, and timing matters more than people realize. Beans from the most recent harvest cook faster and taste better than beans that have sat around for a year or two. Old, dried-out beans can take much longer to soften and never fully lose their toughness. Buying that year's crop while it's fresh, then storing it in sealed containers with oxygen absorbers, keeps quality high and gives a household one of the cheapest, longest-lasting protein sources available. A 25 lb bag, cooked down, will stretch across many, many meals for a fraction of what the equivalent protein would cost at a meat counter. Plain old-fashioned oats, bought in bulk from a mill or bulk food store rather than in small name-brand canisters, are dramatically cheaper per pound, often a third of the price or less once you account for packaging and marketing built into a branded box. Amish families buy the big sack, portion it into jars, and eat oatmeal through the winter for pennies a bowl. The wider point they landed on, whether or not they'd frame it this way, is one that food economists have made for years. A large share of what shoppers pay for processed grain products goes to packaging, branding, and the margins of a small number of large processors, rather than to the grain itself. Buying closer to the source, a mill or a bulk supplier, cuts that markup out. Local beekeepers typically pull honey twice a year, once in late June and again in late summer as goldenrod and clover finish blooming. The late summer harvest tends to have a deeper flavor and higher mineral content, and it's the batch many Amish families buy by the gallon directly from beekeepers to see them through winter baking, tea, and home remedies. Honey is famously durable in sealed storage. Jars recovered from ancient Egyptian tombs have been found still edible thousands of years later, because honey's low moisture and natural acidity make it inhospitable to the microbes that spoil other foods. A gallon bought in August will be just as good the following spring. Coffee is one of the more globally exposed items on this list. A drought in Brazil or a shipping disruption anywhere along the supply chain can move retail prices noticeably within a season. Buying whole beans in bulk, vacuum sealing them into smaller portions, and storing them in a cool, dark spot extends useful shelf life well beyond what a pre-ground bag on a store shelf will manage. Ground coffee loses aroma and flavor within weeks of grinding, while sealed whole beans hold up for well over a year. These two are worth stocking together because they do different jobs on different timelines. Baking soda is close to indestructible in storage. Beyond its use as a leavening agent, it works as a cleaner, a deodorizer, a mild abrasive, and a way to smother a small stovetop grease fire, and it holds most of its usefulness for years, even if its leavening power fades slightly over time. Baking powder is the one that actually goes stale. It loses real leavening strength after a year or so, which is why it makes sense to buy it closer to when it'll be used rather than stockpiling it for years the way you might sugar or salt. A simple version of this system doesn't require a farm or a root cellar. 4 half-gallon jars on any shelf, labeled sugar, salt, baking soda, and baking powder, cover a surprising amount of a household's baking and preserving needs on their own. Wheat harvest in the Midwest peaks in July, and flour milled from that fresh crop reaches bulk stores by mid-August at its best quality. Flour loses baking strength and can pick up off flavors from oxidation as it ages past about a year. So buying it fresh and storing it in sealed, airtight containers with something like a bay leaf added to discourage pantry pests keeps it usable well into the following year. A 50 lb sack goes a long way. Home-baked bread from bulk flour costs a small fraction of what the equivalent number of loaves would cost at a bakery. For a household without a milk cow on hand, dry milk is the backup for baking, gravy, and pancakes when the refrigerator runs low. Buying it before autumn avoids the price swings that can follow fall dairy contract negotiations, and it keeps remarkably well. The USDA has stated that non-fat dry milk, stored dry and below about 75 degrees, can be kept essentially indefinitely, with unopened containers often still good 2 to 10 years past their printed date. A long-running food science study out of Brigham Young University even evaluated non-fat dry milk that had been stored for up to 29 years and found it still retained usable quality and nutrition when packaging and storage conditions were good. Whole milk powder, by contrast, contains fat that goes rancid. It's specifically the non-fat version that stores this well. This is the technique most people have never heard of, and it's the one worth paying closest attention to. Hens lay at their peak between roughly June and August, which means late summer is when eggs are most abundant and cheapest, and also the point at which a technique called water glassing, or liming, lets a household bank that abundance for months. The method is old. Agricultural extension circulars describing it go back to at least the early 1900s, including a 1917 circular from the Utah Agricultural College, noting that egg preservation has passed the experimental stage even then. During the food rationing years of the Second World War, extension services across the country, including in Pennsylvania, published guidance encouraging farm households to preserve surplus eggs at home rather than let them go to waste, at a time when store-bought eggs, sugar, and coffee were all restricted by ration coupons. The original method used sodium silicate, literally water glass, dissolved in water. Today, most people use food-grade pickling lime, calcium hydroxide, instead because it's easier to source and doesn't carry sodium silicate's tendency to leave eggs unable to whip properly. The process is simple. Dissolve about 1 ounce of pickling lime per quart of water. Submerge clean, unwashed, uncracked eggs completely in the solution inside a crock or food-grade bucket. Weigh them down if they float, seal the container, and store it somewhere cool and dark. A basement corner works well. The alkaline lime solution seals the eggshell's natural pores and creates an environment bacteria can't survive in, while leaving the egg inside essentially unchanged. Properly water-glassed eggs are commonly reported to stay good for 8 to 12 months, and sometimes considerably longer, well outside refrigeration. Before use, the lime residue needs to be rinsed off the shell. It's a striking amount of preservation from very little equipment: a bucket, a container of food-grade pickling lime, and a supply of fresh, unwashed eggs, ideally from a local flock, rather than store-bought eggs, which have typically had their natural protective coating washed off during processing. A single container of lime goes a remarkably long way relative to its cost, which is part of why the method quietly persisted in farm communities, even as it disappeared from most mainstream kitchens after refrigeration became standard. None of these 12 items work in total isolation. An Amish pantry functions more like one connected system than 12 separate stockpiles. The salt cures the meat that the vinegar's pickling brine complements. The sugar and the fruit season overlap by design. The flour and the lard show up in the same baked goods. It's less a checklist and more a set of habits that reinforce each other across the year. A few more specifics worth knowing if you want to try any of this yourself. Some Amish households in Ohio favor mined salts like Redmond Real salt, sold from Utah in 25 lb bags, over table salt, loaded with anti-caking agents and additives that can interfere with fermentation. Bulk stores in canning country report selling well over 1,000 pounds of salt to local households by the second week of August in a typical year. Enough for a season's worth of pork curing, sauerkraut, cheese, and butter making. Small local presses that produce raw apple cider vinegar generally only operate while apples are available, meaning there's a real seasonal window, roughly mid-July through mid-October in much of the Midwest, after which the supply is simply gone until the next harvest. Pasteurized grocery store vinegar will still preserve a cucumber, but raw, unpasteurized vinegar behaves differently in fermentation than the pasteurized version. You don't need a farm to do this. A local butcher, not a supermarket meat counter, will often sell leaf fat cheaply, since most customers don't ask for it. Cut it into cubes, render it slowly in a slow cooker over several hours, and strain it through cheesecloth. Properly rendered lard keeps in a cool pantry for about a year and costs a small fraction of what an equivalent volume of shelf-stable vegetable shortening would run. Whole wheat berries and home milling. Freshly milled flour begins losing nutritional value within days, and commercial white flour has had the nutrient-dense German bran removed entirely. Whole wheat berries, on the other hand, keep for years when sealed properly, which is why some Amish households buy several sacks of berries rather than pre-milled flour and grind small batches, as needed on a hand-cranked mill. A piece of equipment that, once bought, tends to last for decades and requires no electricity. Ball and Kerr, the two major U.S. manufacturers of home canning jars, routinely run short of popular sizes during the peak canning months of June through September as demand from home canners nationwide outpaces production. Buying jars in spring before that seasonal crunch and keeping a standing supply on hand year to year, jars themselves last indefinitely if they don't break, though the flat lids need replacing each season. Avoid scrambling for jars. Once the tomatoes and cucumbers actually come in, the common thread across all 12 items is really just this. Buy staple foods when they're fresh, cheap, and in season, store them properly, and you can go a long way toward not depending on a weekly grocery run. It isn't a secret. It's mostly just a set of habits that used to be common in American kitchens and that some communities, for reasons of culture and practicality both, never stopped practicing. It's worth slowing down on a few of these items individually because the reasoning behind the timing is more specific than buy it before it runs out. Take the salt again. The distinction between plain canning salt and an additive-free mineral salt like Redmond Real Salt isn't just a preference. Additives like dextrose and anti-caking agents can genuinely interfere with the fermentation that turns cabbage into sauerkraut or cucumbers into a proper brined pickle, because those processes depend on specific bacterial cultures behaving predictably in a clean brine. A household planning to cure a hog, put up kraut, make cheese, and salt down butter across a full season needs far more salt than most people keep in the cupboard, which is part of why bulk purchases in the tens or hundreds of pounds aren't unusual in canning country by the second week of August. The vinegar situation follows its own calendar. Small local presses that produce raw, unpasteurized apple cider vinegar are tied directly to the apple harvest. They press while there are apples, and they stop when there aren't. In much of the Midwest, that's roughly a 90-day window running from mid-July into October, closing whenever the first hard frost arrives, which in places like northeastern Ohio typically lands somewhere in the first 3 weeks of October. Miss that window, and the only vinegar left on the shelf is the pasteurized, filtered grocery store version, fine for basic pickling. But it doesn't carry the live cultures that raw vinegar does, and it behaves differently in ferments that rely on that microbial activity. Rendering lard is more approachable than it sounds, and it doesn't require owning any animals. A real butcher shop, not a supermarket meat counter, will often set aside leaf fat, the fat around a hog's kidneys that renders into the cleanest, most neutral-tasting lard, and sell it inexpensively simply because most customers never ask for it. Cut into small cubes and rendered slowly in a slow cooker over several hours, then strained through cheesecloth, that fat becomes a shelf-stable cooking fat that keeps in a cool pantry for roughly a year, compared with the vegetable oil-based shortening sold at grocery stores, typically soybean or palm oil, hydrogenated into a solid. Home-rendered lard costs a fraction as much for the same volume, and it behaves differently in baking, producing flakier pie crusts and biscuits, on sugar specifically. Because so much of it goes toward preserving the fruit that ripens through late summer and fall, peaches, then pears, then apples, then grapes, a household doing serious canning can easily go through well over 100 pounds between midsummer and the end of the season. And because dry sugar is essentially immune to spoilage as long as moisture stays out, there's no real downside to buying ahead. Properly sealed jars of fruit preserved decades earlier, when opened, often still taste distinctly of the fruit that went into them, a testament to how effectively sugar and heat processing lock a food in place. Honey deserves one more note on sourcing. With well over 100,000 registered beekeepers across the United States, and likely many more keeping bees informally, a local source is usually not hard to find within reasonable driving distance. Raw honey bought directly from a beekeeper, rather than a filtered and blended supermarket blend, typically costs more per gallon, but carries more of the local pollen and enzyme content that gets stripped out during commercial processing. And because a full gallon weighs around 12 pounds and essentially never spoils in a sealed jar, a modest supply on the shelf covers a household through any single poor honey season without concern. On flour and whole grain, freshly milled flour begins losing nutrients within days of milling, and by the time a bag of white flour reaches a grocery shelf, much of its natural nutrition has already been stripped out, along with the wheat germ and bran, with a handful of synthetic vitamins added back in to meet fortification standards. Whole wheat berries sidestep this problem almost entirely, because left unmilled, the grain's natural oils and nutrients stay intact and dormant for years in dry storage. Some households report grain still baking well after a decade or more of proper sealed storage. Hand-cranked mills built for home use, of the kind that bolt to a countertop and turn out a cup of flour in under 2 minutes of steady cranking, are built to last for generations. It isn't unusual to find a family still using the same mill a grandparent bought decades earlier. On dry beans. A pound of dried pinto beans is one of the least expensive sources of protein and fiber available at any grocery store, and cooked down, that single pound yields several cups, enough for a substantial meal for a family of 4. Because beans lose moisture and toughen the longer they sit in storage, buying that year's fresh harvest rather than beans that have been sitting in a warehouse for a year or two makes a real difference in cooking time and texture. Bought in 25 or 50 lb sacks and transferred into sealed, food-grade containers, dry beans require no refrigeration, no electricity, and remain usable for years. And on canning jars, the seasonal shortage is a real, well-documented pattern. Ball and Kerr, the 2 dominant manufacturers supplying most of the U.S. home canning market, see demand spike sharply every summer as gardens and orchards come in, and it's common for popular jar sizes, wide-mouth quarts especially, to sell out at rural hardware and bulk stores by the middle of August. Because glass jars themselves don't wear out if they aren't broken, and rings can be reused for years, the only annual consumable is the flat metal lid that creates the seal, which is inexpensive to restock. A household that buys a few hundred jars once in spring before the rush and simply keeps them clean and stacked through the winter avoids that scramble entirely, and ends up with a standing supply that can look, to an outsider, like a lot more jars than any one family could possibly need, right up until the tomatoes start coming in all at once. None of this requires living on a farm, owning livestock, or giving up modern conveniences. It requires a cool, dry shelf, a handful of sealed containers, and buying staple foods at the point in the year when they're freshest and least expensive, which, for most of what's on this list, is some point in the 6 or 8 weeks before summer turns to fall.